You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Episode 147, The Paradox.
Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome to The Paradox. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Larson. Thank you for joining me as we explore the U.S. medical system in fun and informative format through expert analysis. And today's expert is Dr. Sean Deoni, who's the lead scientist for the study that came out of Brown that is still in preprint, but we're discussed today, which is, I guess you'd just say, simply very concerning. His team focuses on the neurodevelopment of infants and toddlers and actually young children. And they notice a significant change in the development of kids, basically infants and early toddlers, beginning with the pandemic year of 2020 and extending into 2021. And I'm sure you're going to find this conversation really enlightening, interesting, and probably very concerning too, especially if you're a parent of a young child or infant. Certainly a question we've asked ourselves is, what is the effect of the pandemic and the restrictions, the measures we do to protect ourselves and to protect each other? What effect does this have on children? Not only kids in school, but early children and early childhood development, especially infants. The most important critical time for laying the foundation for your brain development is, of course, the first 2 years of life, although your brain does continue developing through age 25. But we know those first years are extremely important, and the environment is very important with the development as well, and it's probably the single most important factor. And the environment includes parents, caregivers, everything else around you. And what does that all mean for kids who are born in this time? So we're going to get into a great discussion. I recommend you go to theparadox.com/147. There you can get the show notes and find the studies that we discuss, not only Dr. Deoni's, but also the study we talked about from the University of Columbia. And following our conversation, there'll be a brief little discussion I'm going to have where I'm just going to talk about some basic tenets of what we discussed, things that are probably important points to take away, because this can be a very hyperbolic and inflammatory episode. It's not meant to be that. It's obviously meant to be interesting, provocative, but we're not trying to make any political points here. But I want to make sure that that's clear afterwards, and we'll talk about some of the more important points and things that we can know for sure and not for sure after this discussion, which I think is very important. And now the last ad read for the Doctor Podcast Network. In healthcare, there are smart pieces of technology that businesses can't live without. Deputy has become one of those essential platforms for more than 250,000 workplaces. It's helping medical practices schedule their staff more efficiently to meet peaks in patient demand. And it makes it easy to adjust schedules when the unexpected happens, like staff calling out sick. You can use Deputy on any device on the go. Within a few minutes of picking it up, you'll see why it has hundreds of glowing reviews from managers and staff alike. To find out more and try Deputy for free, go to drpodcastnetwork.com/deputy. But without further ado, my discussion with Dr. Deoni: has the pandemic led to infants losing IQ? Enjoy. Well, hi, I'm here with my new friend, Dr. Sean Deoni. Sean is has his PhD in MRI physics, which I didn't even know was a thing until just a few minutes ago, from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. He did his postdoc training at King's College in London and University of Oxford. He's currently at Brown, where he works in a lab where they do a lot of testing on neurodevelopmental testing for kids and in development. Advanced baby imaging lab focusing on investigating fetal, infant, and childhood brain development using neurocognitive tools and neuroimaging, and trying to understand how a child's environment influences and shapes their environment. Dr. Deoni, thanks so much for joining The Paradox.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is great.
Well, we're going to talk about your preprint that, I don't know, when did you publish it? Is pretty recently?
Yeah, I think it's coming up on 3-4 weeks or so. Short enough that it's still under review. So
right.
So yeah.
So the preprint is about neurodevelopment for infants specifically who were born during the pandemic. So it'd be 2020 basically, and up until the first few months of 2021.
That's right. Yeah, we sort of spaced it out. So we had kiddos from about July. So we wanted to kind of get one term or at least the last trimester in utero during the beginning stages of the pandemic, and then followed up until about August or so of this year. So just a little bit over about 13 months or so.
And, I think before we begin the discussion, I think it's important to sort of discuss what a preprint is. And I think there's been a lot. Preprints are basically a way for someone to present their findings. It gives an opportunity for other scientists to know what's going on, maybe in the field, right? To get ideas, to offer critiques, or, say, hey, we've already done this or whatever, right? I mean, that's an opportunity to tell people about it. What has happened, of course, with COVID, because it's just such a charged issue, people grab onto preprints and they become their own. They become something else. And sometimes the preprints are things that are never going to see publication because they don't get through peer review. So I guess that's sort of the disclaimer, I guess, we're going to talk about preprint. Yep. And it has now just become, I think it's not dangerous, but it's certainly, you have to be a little bit more cognizant of what you're putting out, publishing as a preprint nowadays, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. So, this is certainly my first foray into the preprint world, as it were. And certainly, I definitely saw it as you do, sort of more from the physics side of things, where you typically put things out to kind of vet them before they would go in for formal peer review. And thinking that was kind of going to be the process and we get some feedback. And that certainly has happened. It's been great. About 3 or 4 or 5 people have requested the data and kind of pounded through it and put it through the ringer, which is what you really want, right? You want to make sure that you didn't do something silly or sloppy with the analysis or whatnot. And so, yeah, that's where we're kind of coming from. Although it does, as you say, take on a life of its own sometimes. And, people will take to you on social media, which has also happened. So that was less desirable than the people kind of vetting the data and whatnot.
Yeah, right. And I guess, today's age, it's just a reality, right? That's just something we have to accept. And, whether people just look at headlines or not, I guess there's nothing you can do about that anyway, right? It's the classic, the headlines, what has nothing to do with it, the lead of the story, right? And so you have to be discerning in how you take information.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about the study, because I think it's, when I heard about this, I was pretty amazed, interested. I'm an anesthesiologist by background, so I have zero knowledge in child development outside of the physiologic changes, right? Like, I know their basic vital signs for kids are totally different than adults, but as far as the development goes, maybe the best place to start is let's talk about what the study is. It follows a well-established cohort that's been in a process that's been going on for years, right? So the data is extracted from it's not something that started novelly in 2020, right? This is something that's been going on for quite some time. So why don't you talk about that process first, where the background data comes from?
Sure. Yeah. Just to give some context. So the lab that we run kind of had its formation in about 2009, 2010. And the basic idea there was, as you kind of alluded to in the introduction, was really to understand patterns of normal, healthy brain development. So we were recruiting typically developing kiddos. So those are kids born, full term, normal birth weight, no major risk factors for developmental disorders, those sorts of things. So mom was healthy, dad's healthy, that sort of thing. And we've been continuously enrolling kids since then. So we've been lucky enough to get, grants to continue, not only continue following those kiddos as they've gone from, infants to toddlers to children to now, early adolescents and pre-adolescents, but to continue enrolling, consecutively. And so what that's allowed us to do then was really end up with a data set where we had, close to 10 years of normative healthy data, and then suddenly a dramatic change in the environment. So that's the other thing that we're kind of interested in understanding. So not only mapping out these trajectories of normative development and really understanding relationships between brain structure and function that we get from MRI or EEG, and then their cognitive performance, but then really trying to understand how that child's environment is shaping those relationships. And that environment is broad. So it's things like nutrition, even the home environment, SES, so socioeconomic status, those sorts of things. What kind of daycare did they go to? Multi versus single language families, those sorts of things. And as you say, so once we hit into 2020, we never really slowed down, but suddenly the environment shifted, right? We went from a place where kids were going to school normally, doing their normal thing. Babies were being born. Moms would take them home. They would go off into daycare, the usual suspects, right? We'd have mom groups or dad, family groups and uncles and grandparents coming over and all that sort of stuff. And all of that stopped. And most labs, and this is kind of a distinguishing feature that we had, is that most labs that kind of do this work shut down, or at least went virtual. And so that they weren't bringing the families in and the kiddos in. We fortunately never had to go to that extreme, but obviously we had to take all the usual precautions. So, PPE, masks, those sorts of things. But we were still able to bring kiddos in and continue almost doing what we'd always been doing. And as that wore on, there just became this sort of chorus from our RAs and research assistants and our psychologists saying, these kids are acting very differently. Assessments that used to take 15 minutes are now taking 45 minutes. It's really hard to get their attention. There's something kind of weird going on. And so that's kind of what spurred us just wanting to have a look at the data and see, what's been happening over the last, both over the last decade in terms of those sort of normative measures that we would see. And then specifically, once we looked at that and saw some changes, it was in kind of, well, let's actually look at the kiddos who've been born since almost the beginning of the pandemic, and going back to last July until almost this July or August. And from that's when we began to see some really sort of disturbing trends, as it were.
Right. And so that kind of gets us to where we are today. So I guess to summarize a little bit to make sure we get this accurately assessed, that we have basically 10 years of fairly steady environment, right? Doesn't change much. Our outcomes are pretty much consistent from year to year. I mean, obviously it fluctuates a little bit, like an average. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But essentially, things are pretty much normal, as what we'll define as normal. And then you notice a large change in 2020, where we have an environment, like as you mentioned, with is a lot different. And so when we look at kids, especially infants, their development's very much affected by their environment, right? I mean, obviously verbal, visual, motor skills, all those things are very important, and many argue it's some of the most important years, is certainly with the plasticity of the brain as far as its development, right? Why don't you talk about what you sort of expect to see from infants in that first year, and what you guys observed that was different?
Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, so we typically, in order to sort of assess behavior and cognition, we use a standardized tool called the Mullen scales of early learning. And that is, as I say, sort of a population normed tool. So it's a tool that was developed about 15, almost maybe 20 years ago, ironically in Rhode Island, which is where we're from, although that's not why we chose it. But it's used really as a developmental screening tool, as it were. So it kind of divides behavior up into 5 major domains. So fine and gross motor control. So gross motor control obviously being standing up, sitting down, moving your arms, those sorts of things. Fine control being picking up small objects and moving them around and manipulating them. Visual reception, so your ability to see things and react to things visually. And then expressive and receptive language, right? So expressive, obviously being able to talk, and receptive, understanding terms, understanding instruction, and then acting upon them. And so you can imagine that the scale itself runs from birth, about 1 to 2 months of age, up to almost 6 years of age, so about 5.5 years of age. Okay. And it obviously gets progressively harder as you get older. So it starts off with very simple things like just sitting up. How long do you sit up before you fall over? Do you orient to mom's voice? These sorts of things. Obviously up until what we would consider more the IQ test type things that you would typically do, which is putting shapes together, patterns together, those sorts of things. And the reason we say it's normed is that it's set up so that whenever you test any child of any age, you can convert that into a standardized score that you can compare. We compare it to other kids, you can compare it with that same child as they get older, and it should stay about the same. And so we typically norm, like your IQ tests that you might be more familiar with, they're normed, as we say, to a level of a mean of 100, and a standard deviation of 15. So, 66% of kids will lie within one standard deviation, so 85 to 115, and then 93 or so percent between two standard deviations, so that's 70 to 130. So if we take that back and we look at the kiddos that we were testing from 2009, 10, 11, 12, we see very much what you'd expect, that the mean is kind of bouncing, as you said, kind of bouncing around between 97, 98, 103, bouncing around that 100, but staying very close to that 100 level. By the time we get to 2020, the second half of 2020, that then begins to drop down to the high 80s. And then the first half of 2021, it drops down to 78, right? So you're now getting well over almost 1.5 standard deviations as your mean, right? So it's almost like falling off a cliff. And that was obviously really surprising. And we saw that both on sort of the overall measure that we call it early learning composite, which analogous is IQ, but let's not equate those. They're not the same, but that's the analog. And then you can also look at verbal skills and motor skills. And all three of those were dropping precipitously between 2020 to 2021. When we looked at that a little bit further, then we went out and said, well, what is it? What's driving this drop? Thinking that it was probably some of the older kids, right, who were going to daycare and having that interaction, and suddenly that stopped. So we started looking at that, but realized actually it's not the older kids that were driving the value down. It was the younger kids, the infants and toddlers. And so that's brought up the second question then, which was to look at the infants who were born, as you say, between July of 2020 and August 2021, versus the same kiddos or the same children of the same age going back 10 years. And it's there that we saw this huge difference between the two. And so those kids now, again, being 1.5 to 2 standard deviations on average below the historical trends that we've seen. And that kind of pointing, being some of the surprising, to me at least, and to most people who've read the paper, the surprising result.
Yeah, I don't know. The magnitude of 1.5 standard deviations to someone who's a non-scientist is it's maybe not, you maybe can't appreciate how big a difference in drop that is. I mean, if you were to meet someone who with an IQ of 120 and an IQ of 80, it would be, there'd be no question, right? I mean, you would absolutely be able to tell immediately that you have people of, various intellects. I mean, it's a huge difference. And so I guess maybe just to be clear, when you're looking at all these ages, you're finding the biggest difference is just in infants. Were you noticing a big drop in 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds, or was it pretty much only seen in infants and early toddlers, I guess?
It was really in the early 0 to 18 months was really showing the drop. Yeah, the other ones, there was a slight trend down, but it wasn't as precipitous as what we're seeing. And you're right, when you talk about 1 or 2 standard deviations or 20 to 30 points, normally when we're doing nutrition interventions, you're happy to see 5 points.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You're really pushing for these really those would be considered large effects. So this was as you say sort of whoa, what's going on here? There's something going on here.
Right, because if you were to have an intervention that have a over standard deviation difference, that'd be a massive therapeutic gain for something like, I don't even know what the example would be. It's sort of like having the ability to have antibiotics or not in battling pneumonia or something. It'd be like night and day sort of thing, right? So there are lots of questions sort of come from that statement, because that's, I don't know about provocative, but it's certainly concerning. It's, it's momentous. Are there other places that people have seen this, or are you sort of the only people who have this kind of data set where you continue testing throughout the pandemic, and so you're not aware of anyone else with these similar findings?
Yeah. So the only other one that I've seen actually comes from some colleagues at University of Columbia. Slightly different test. So they weren't able to actually assess kiddos in their lab. So they were using a parent report, which we call the Ages and Stages questionnaire. Kind of gets at the same things, but obviously depends on a parent's perception of the child as opposed to a neuropsychologist or someone who's trained on that. But they found exactly the same thing. So they didn't have a large pre-existing data set, so they were kind of going with historical norms of the tool. They had a small historical set that they pulled out, which aligned with the norms of the tool, but also found this sort of similar drop in kiddos. And actually, their study went a little bit further in the sense that they looked at kiddos not only born during the pandemic, but there's a subgroup or a separate group whose parents had COVID, moms had COVID during pregnancy. Okay. They were kind of exposed during pregnancy, and they found no difference between those groups. But overall, they were much lower on their ASQ scores than the historical reference. So kind of similar sort of finding, but a different tool, which is nice in some ways and also frustrating in others that it's so close and yet not quite the same.
Right. I mean, obviously, you'd rather have kids not have any sort of concerns about intelligence, right? I mean, you absolutely.
That's it.
And I would say, someone might say, well, our tests are designed to examine people in an environment that is normalized, as you mentioned before, right? And suddenly you change the environment. And so maybe the things that kids could do before, we shouldn't expect them to be able to do before, right? Or, later, like you wouldn't expect a kid from 1800 to walk up and use an iPad or to know to look both ways before crossing a street. There are things that are skills that we would consider baseline that, we might not in a different situation. And it wouldn't be because the kid's less intelligent. It's because just a different world. How much would you attribute to that, or do you think it's something else?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And but one of the things that was actually pointed out, that came out of other groups looking at the data and kind of reporting back was that because another concern was, well, you kind of mentioned the testing environment, right? The norm testing environment, and the testing environment has changed, right? We've now put on masks, right, onto our examiners and onto the child. So there was a thought, and we alluded to it in the discussion as well, that maybe it is just the mask wearing or that environment that's changed, the testing environment that's leading to this, and it's sort of an artifact, as it were. What was interesting that speaks to both of these points is that it wasn't things that you might expect to be altered through that kind of environment. It wasn't language type skills that you'd want to see the face, or that sort of visual impression and social emotional aspects where you want to see the face or you want to see what's happening. It was motor skills. So simply things like sitting up, rolling over, those sorts of things, those sort of standard developmental milestones were delayed. And that was what was actually pulling down the average scores. And so that kind of has sort of now kind of made us think, well, what is happening? Because you wouldn't expect motor skills to be delayed unless maybe, and these are things that we want to now think about going back and asking parents about or trying to get some other information on. They're not out at playgrounds or they're not outside playing. And so those sorts of, playing around, manipulations, that sort of stuff, playing with their parents, rolling around, being at daycare, rolling around with other kids, that sort of stuff hasn't quite been there to the same degree. And maybe it will come back quickly once they start getting into that, right? But that was kind of the weird thing, is that it was mainly these sort of, what I would say sort of standard motor milestones that you would sort of think, and have been shown to be sort of pretty consistent even across different cultures and whatnot, that sort of hit at the same time point. These are all being delayed a little bit, which is weird. It's that it wouldn't have been my thought. I would have thought it'd been more on the language, social emotional interaction, that sort of stuff that was being altered. But it's
right. I mean, that's logical, right? That you're not able to see the faces. I mean, although you could argue most infants are seeing their parents. I mean, most people are not masked up in their homes.
Right.
But when they're out in daycare, other environments, or seeing relatives or seeing people on the street, they're not seeing people's faces, or when they're in stores and things like that. And so it's sort of like the classic: if you have a child, excuse me, you never think they're listening until they repeat something back, 3 months later, right? So you never think the kids are paying attention or processing anything, and yet it's probable that they are processing things all the time. And so I guess, but again, you would expect it to be verbal, you'd expect to be visual things, then motor skills. So if someone's concerned about this, they'd say, well, tell me if someone is let's say someone is a standard deviation, let's say they normally test a standard deviation below, or like half a standard deviation. Let's say their IQ would say is equivalent is like 90. Do we see that consistently stay 90 through their development through 5 or 6? Is that what has been shown in the data set previously? Or do we see lots moving around in those intelligence scores normally?
So that's a good thing. So the Mullens itself and similar types of assessments in early kiddos do fluctuate, right? Because as every parent knows, right, you have your the anecdotal, oh, my child is talking really early, but they're not walking or crawling yet, right? And they crawl a lot later, or vice versa. Like my kid is able to climb all over stuff, but his language isn't quite there. And then one day they just speak, and then that's the end of it, right? It's all that concern was for naught. And that's true until those scores start continuing on until about 18 to 24 months. So we're kind of getting to that window now, right? And then things begin to become pretty consistent. Where you are is where you stay. And you don't tend to jump, huge amounts. Certainly between, 3 months of age and a year and a half, you can see pretty large movements. Not typically a standard deviation, but you can see movements. So my major concern is actually for the older kiddos, right? If they're still there now, coming up now almost on, a year and a half to 2 years, that becomes a lot harder to sort of push up, as it were. You don't see a huge, we haven't traditionally seen kids at, 2, 3, 4 years of age make sizable jumps in those values. They tend to stay in their quantile or their percentile pretty consistently.
Right. We oftentimes say kids are really resilient and that they can sort of, face anything. But I think, you're in neurodevelopment for children. You probably have a completely opposite opinion in some ways, right? Like the environment is really important for these kids' development. And as you said, it's kind of, at some point, we think you're kind of set once you're at a certain point, right? At age. And so the environment that you're developing your brain in initially, the first 1 or 2 years of your life, is really important. And so we can't just discount and say, well, kids are resilient, they'll be fine, and they're the tabula rasa, right? They're the blank slate. They can become whatever we want them to become later. There's intelligence innate and those sorts of things. All those things probably are somewhat true, but there's a genetic component. It's a nature nurture discussion, right? But there's some truth, I suppose, to if you don't have that right environment the first couple of years, you may never catch up.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. I mean, we kind of have, not to steal your term, right? There is a paradox, right? In the sense of we have this idea that kids are, as you say, really resilient. They bounce back. They're At the same time, we also talk about the importance of the first 1,000 days, right? And how critical that is to establishing lifelong patterns of not only mental health, but cardiovascular health, physical health, obesity, all those sorts of things. And so, as you say, and so we actually see that, right? We see relative fluctuation of developmental milestones over those first 2 years of life, as every parent, kind of talks to you, right? Oh, my kid was started to walk at 9 months. No, my kid started walking at 12 months, and my kid started walking at 18 months, and they're fine. But you don't hear that happening after 2, right? So not that,
right.
Not that 1,000 days is exactly this hard limit that, once you're 1,001, that's it. We've written your book, but it just becomes harder and harder to, that plasticity and the foundation, as I kind of like to think about it, it's like building a house. It's a lot easier to change your mind when you're just dealing with the foundation than once you've, put up the first story and second story, and then you're like, I'd really like to move that wall. It's a lot harder now, right? So, and that difficulty becomes greater as you get older. So we're kind of, as I say, we're kind of getting into that time period now where these kiddos are, most of them now are a year that were in our cohort, so they're a year to 18 months. So they're kind of pushing that upper boundary where I would at least be a lot more concerned, or am a lot more concerned.
Yeah, right. This brings, and of course, the problem is with these kids, you can't ask them. You can't, the normal assessments of, how you doing, you can't do. You can't really find out what the long-term implications are or anything until the long-term has happened, right? And that's the big concern of all these things. And when you're looking at this situation, so let's say you're a policymaker and you're like, whoa, this is really concerning. We need to do something. You can only do something if you know what the problem is, right? And so like right now we're just talking. We're like, there's clearly a problem, or there's at least, if not a problem, there's at least a concerning trend, let's say, right? we don't think it's the things that are obvious because you said it's not verbal. So, I mean, how would you like correct this? I mean, do we just need to have kids out doing more things? Do we need to, I guess, what's causing this? I guess it's the real question, right? And I'm sure that's what you're trying to figure out. Is it, you said the one study said it's not people who've had COVID. So it's not like some viral encephalitis or some sort of thing, something like that we don't, at least we don't think so. Is it like stress from parents because they're living in a really stressful environment right now? I mean, what do you think is, what have you just ruled out, I guess is probably the best question.
Yeah, so that's another interesting point, right? So that was the other thing that we thought was going to be a factor, right? So is it stress? Because there has been some really nice work early on in the pandemic showing that pregnant moms in particular were quite stressed, right? They were quite anxious. They didn't know what was going on. Did this affect me? Will it affect my baby? That sort of stuff. We actually test for and do another standardized. Now, granted, it's a parent report of maternal anxiety and stress called a perceived stress index. Ironically, we found no difference in our historical data to the mums that we had. Now, that could be because mums coming in for a study visit are less stressed about the environment, right? The ones who were really stressed stayed home, right?
Right. Selection bias. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a possibility. So we have a very unique. Although then you start to say, well, then that's not it, right? That's not driving.
Right. Because then you would have the kids would it be normal, right? If that was, yeah. Right. Yeah. Right.
And that actually then brings up the question, well, what about the ones who didn't come in?
Worse off, yeah.
Right, what's happening with them? The other thing that we did find that was related, and actually it was an amplifying effect, so we call that an interaction effect, was low SES. So lower socioeconomic status, lower family income, lower maternal or household education levels. So not surprising, SES has always been a historical relationship to cognition, right? Kids with access to early education, more stimulating environments do better, and so they're even worse off, right? So they're taking a double hit, as it were, which might kind of link again back to some of this stress, but it's not the overwhelming driver. I think my own personal opinion, because we do also collect, and this wasn't in the paper, but it's an anecdotal point. But just one thing I'll put out there. So again, this isn't peer reviewed, and this isn't even talked about. But we do also collect information on language interaction between parents and children, and we do that with these little devices. It looks like a weird love child of a Sony Walkman and a deck of cards, basically. So it's it's about this big. It sits right on the center. I think it literally is a tape recorder. And it records interaction and sounds between parents or between caregivers and the child, and then teases that out to tell how many vocal interactions have occurred. And what we found with that is that, again, looking back to our historical data, is that kids are being interacted with less at home or in their caregiver environment, so wherever they're wearing it. So there does seem to be less of that interaction, which could relate to playtime and just general playing around and doing things. And certainly, and again, anecdotally from my own life, we went to work from home. Skype meetings started off, or Zoom meetings started off usually between the normal business hours, and then they slowly extended on both ends, right? Yeah. And so that time to kind of get away, go play with your kiddos a little bit, maybe was lessened a little bit. And so as a parent myself, I've kind of sort of tried to really put in, let's go and play with them a little bit more, roll around with them and that sort of stuff. Thinking that, again, that might be one of these aspects that they're just kind of missing out. And so, going back to your question of, what would we be thinking about as a policymaker? My thoughts are, your first line of defense is going to be those daycares and kindergarten, preschool, and those early Head Start programs, right? That are going to kind of give a little bit more of that stimulation that they might be missing or might have missed, right? To kind of boost them up. I think that's probably where that's going to be the primary sort of junction point, I think, or interaction point.
Do you have a feel for, and maybe you don't have the numbers in front of you, but what percentage of your study participants actually go to daycare? Because if, for instance, if none of them went to daycare, well then couldn't say it's the policies, at least for the day, it's the caregivers. It's something how with the employment status or going on in the home.
Yeah. No, about 90% of our kiddos are in daycare, and that was,
Okay.
that was obviously most of those parents did report that had been shifted, right? So they had to go to somewhere else, and so they had to make a change in their normal caregiving routine. So that could be one possibility.
Yeah, well, I mean, it'd be a location that you could have, like you said. If you're looking for differences, you could assume things are mostly the same at home. Although it sounds like it's even a little bit different at home too, which is, this is always the sticky thing, right? When it comes to COVID and with policies and what kids can do, what we're doing that makes sense, what helps them, because you can't. They're not going to the playground with their friends at age 12, 13 months. Maybe they have some cousins who come over occasionally or something. They see grandparents, but I suppose all those normal interactions probably were minimized, right? So just seeing relatives and cousins and those sorts of things. And so I'm just trying to think through, what caused it. You guys probably are just as baffled in many ways, right, as we are, because. Do you still see it carrying on, or do you? For what I mean by that is like when you're, because I assume the study, the data entries continuing.
Yep.
Are you still seeing consistently the same sort of results that the kids are still struggling, or is it improving, or or is it getting worse?
Well, so there's another data point is that again, when you look at the scores, they were low at 6 months when those kids hit 6 months of age. And almost across the board uniformly, they dropped for 12 months. So, that second time point coming back, and that has continued on now to the 18th month. So there is a time interaction as well as to how long the pandemic has gone on, which might also kind of feed back into, again, some of that overall stress that, what's going on in the environment, what are parents feeling that they're bringing home. Some of those kids went through, now these are all under threes. So they're not going to school yet, right? So it's not like they felt a year of no schooling, but they certainly felt another year of not necessarily being at their usual daycare. Rhode Island, cut down the number of kids that were allowed at individual daycares. So they're not seeing that proliferation. As you say, they might not be going out to the parks. Early on, Rhode Island shut down all the parks, right? You couldn't go and just put them in and swing them and all that sort of stuff. So, depending on how long that went on for. So that's the other point that, we did see this precipitous drop that is continuing on, which again is worrisome because we want that to begin to correct, right? We want that to start going in the other direction and start improving.
So do you still see the same problem with 6 months olds right now versus 6 month olds, a year ago, who are now 18 months?
Yeah.
So it hasn't really changed much. It's still the same sort of problem. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really, worrisome.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, everything about it, is not is not great.
Yeah. Right. Right. No, that's too bad. What's the best way for people to move forward, I guess? So let's say you're a parent listening to this and you're like, your kids normally go to daycare. Do you seek out daycares where they have maybe, more kids playing, or, the caregivers don't have masks on or something like that? Do you think those are those things you would seek out as a parent? Because, parents, they have to work. We have to, earn a living. The only option is staying home, right? And oftentimes that's not an option. Yeah. So what would you recommend people do? Because people are going to listen to this and are going to be a little concerned that they're sending their kid to an environment that's low stimulation, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it comes back to, certainly you want that, you want that interaction with both kids of their age, kids slightly older and younger, as well as, adults and caregivers. And so, anywhere that you can get that. And so whether that's, as you say, looking for daycares or areas where, preschool or whatnot that has that, I think the mask, with mask mandates and whatnot, that's kind of that's a different question, and that's going to be the case, and because we don't want to be infecting these kids now on top of that, because that's a whole other thing we don't know about. So let's
right.
No idea about that. So at least the one study sort of showed that at least there was no impact of in utero exposure, but we don't know about actual infection in the kiddo. So. But then, I think, as parents, as hard as it is, when you get home from work, just taking that extra few little minutes to play and talk, roll around. I know myself. I found that sometimes bath time became a little bit more rushed, right? Because you're kind of
Yeah.
rushing to get something done, or you want to take some time for yourself.
Yeah, right.
Right. But maybe just doing that a little bit longer, or another book at bedtime. All those things I think are important, and are the usual things that we're doing. So just trying to maybe turn up the volume on that a little bit is probably that's going to be the best that we're doing, really. As you say, we can't stop going to work. We can't. That's not as you say, an option for many people. Um,
What
yeah, it's tricky. It's really
do we
tricky.
have? Yeah, well, right. And do we have other examples of extraordinary, environmental changes like this that where we have ideas of maybe how it affected kids' development? Maybe a war, or I know there's a Romanian study people kind of talk about the Romanian
Yeah,
orphans, which I
yeah.
don't know
That's
if it's
that's
how
like the
much it.
worst example. Yeah,
I don't
that's
think that's really like something that is really equivalent to this. I mean, I guess it could be if you there's no stimulation, I suppose, but that's probably
yeah.
not the case for these kids. Do we have any sort of other equivalents that were ideas of what might happen?
Not really. I mean, it's. I mean, I guess, but I don't think any of those children were ever obviously studied. Would be, um, kids. As you say, in wartime, who may have been put into, or refugees, right? Refugees might
Sure.
be an example, right? And we do see in those kids, executive functioning deficits when they go to school and whatnot. So if they do go to school, um, so there is some long term effects, but again, it's really difficult to compare this to a refugee camp, or to some of these wartime things. As you say, the Romanian child is one that pops up, but that was no stimulation, right? I mean, they were just put into an
Yeah.
orphanage and left, right? That's a whole different kettle of fish. So, as you say, I don't think we're nearly at that. I hope we're not nearly at that point. But yeah, not really. I think we're kind of, as you say, we're kind of counting on this. Kids are resilient, and I'm not sure I really want to put my trust in that statement, to be honest.
No, I don't. And finally, when you look at the data too, I found it interesting that males seem to be less, or seem to be more affected than
Yeah,
females.
yeah.
But I guess if we look at gross motor skills, is that more important for male development than female development? Maybe is that? Do you think that's perhaps why they're more affected?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in general, and again, this goes to those old anecdotes, but they do kind of hold up. That boys walk and girls talk, right? That sort of, that boys tend to be, and certainly when we look at brain maturation, boys, their motor cortexes and whatnot are developing, pretty quickly. And girls are that early time period is frontal, language and planning and whatnot. They all average out, right? It doesn't, it's no
Yeah,
huge
right.
huge difference. But so I think that's probably why is again that sort of motor skill being dropped down, and they're going to feel it a lot more, right? They're not going to make up those scores on their language side when we start to get to those questions, for example, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Certainly, like my son who doesn't like to read, so yeah, he's not gonna he's not gonna get extra points through his verbal scores. He'd
yeah.
rather stick with the motor. Um, well, I guess the only question is, you expect this to be published hopefully soon. Is this sort of data, is this normally published like annually or something? So do you expect that it is sort of like a, I don't know. Does it normally get? I guess does it normally get published? And are there any things that you see are problems with it getting published or and becoming a study that's validated?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. As I say, I mean, we've gone through the ringer with the data analysis and whatnot. So, I think the major questions that we'll probably be looking at are some of these discussion points, the same that we've had, right? Is it the testing environment does change the masks and that sort of stuff, and are we seeing that? As I say, I don't think it is, because we're seeing it consistently. We're seeing the same, that kids are getting worse, not getting better, or not changing. We can't do the control study, right? It'd be great if
Right.
we could
Yeah.
do
Right.
some kids without a mask and some kids with. We can't do that right now. So now granted, if all this ends and we see a huge suddenly everyone is back up exactly where they're supposed to be, then yeah, there'll be a there'll be a retraction, or it'll be like, hey, you don't teach in masks because clearly it doesn't work, right? There'll be a whole different lesson from that. But I don't see there being a huge problem. But now that I've tempted the publishing gods, who knows what will happen?
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly it's a provocative statement. It's one that's just borne out by your data. It's not something you're looking for. It just happened to be something. And like in science, right? You find something interesting, or you find some sort of aberrancy, right? You want to try and explain it, and that's or if not explain it, at least point it out and let other people try and find ways of developing experiments, or maybe ways of ferreting out confounding factors and trying to figure out, using maybe there's someone who has a longitudinal data set as well that you just don't know of, right?
That'd be great.
Right, who can provide this data. They're like in New Zealand or wherever, like Bangladesh or something, and they can provide what you can't, because they can provide a different sort of environment and say.
Or ideally, it would be like a longitudinal cohort in like one of the states in the U.S. that didn't lock down.
Right. Yeah.
That
Exactly. Yeah.
That would be the perfect confound, because if they don't see anything, then that's, well, actually we have to think through what that would do. But yeah.
Well, right. I mean, this is the problem, right? This is the problem we're always faced with. There's so many confounding factors. Obesity levels, age, working status, economics, all these sorts of things that make it very complicated to try and figure out things. But it's another data point. It's one to look at and to actually consider, and certainly something to keep an eye on. I imagine you guys are going to be following these kids very closely for the next few years, and I'm sure this will not be the first study first publication on these kids, because they're going to be followed out, I guess, at this point for a while to see if they return back to baseline. We'll call it baseline if it's back to the norm.
Yeah, we definitely want to follow them at least into school entry, right? And start getting those sort of data points of that school readiness and that early school performance and whatnot, because that's where as you say, the rubber kind of meets the road as to where they're going to be going, and how they're doing. And I think that's going to be so we definitely want to, again, going back now to the granting gods, we definitely want to be following these kiddos out for another, 3 or 4 years for sure.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine people wouldn't be interested in that outcome too. If nothing else, just for reassurance, right? I mean, that's what you hope, that everything gets back to normal. Yeah. Well, Dr. Deoni, thank you so much for joining the Paradox. I really appreciate it. Where can people find more of your stuff? I mean, I suppose we're expecting the American Journal of Pediatrics. Is that where you guys are hoping to publish this?
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully there. If not, we're on, we have our lab website of babyimaginglab.com. And actually, we're just launching, if I can do a push or not, but we're part of, so the NIH has just announced a large study on long COVID, right? The sort of called cohort. So it's a large study across the U.S. and our group is participating in that. Our lab is participating in that study, along with some colleagues at NYU and Virginia Commonwealth University. And that's a legacy study, unfortunately with an I, so you have to annoyingly spell with LEGACI study.org. So if you are near Rhode Island or New York or Richmond, Virginia, and your child had or was infected with COVID, or you are infected with COVID, you can log on there and participate in that study, and that would be great as well. So so that's probably the easiest places to find information that we have going on.
All right, perfect. Dr. Deoni from Brown University. And I'd recommend everyone check out the paradox.com/147. That'll be where the show notes page will be, which will have links to the baby imaging lab and the correct spelling of legacystudy.org. You also find a photo there. Dr. Deoni has probably the best photo I've had, since he has a giant teddy bear in his, like a great pediatric researcher. You've got the teddy bear there, so I love it. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
I want to just touch on a few things before I end this podcast. I don't normally do this, in fact, almost never. But I want to make sure that some points are obvious to people who are listening to this and may draw conclusions which I think are incorrect or potentially incorrect. One, this data set is just from one place in the United States. It was corroborated from Columbia University, so we can say with some, I suppose, certainty or confidence that this is probably somewhat true. But we have to recognize a few things. One, we don't know how persistent these deficits are. Maybe these IQ equivalent developmental milestones won't pan out to be any difference at all. And so that, of course, it will recover, which we sort of mentioned in the show. But we also have a data set and kids and parents who are maybe not representative of the entire country. So it's possible that just in this location at Brown University, in Providence, Rhode Island, the types of people who sign up for the study, they have similar workflows, they have the similar home lives, and the high daycare utilization of 90% is pretty unusual. I think that's not probably the usual breakdown in the country. So that may have a significant effect. It's obviously in an urban area, so it may be different in a rural area. So there are extrapolations we can't entirely make. So we can't say definitively that the pandemic has caused all these things or our measures have. We have to be somewhat thoughtful about what measures might be going on. Clearly, we can say that the kids within this study cohort are behind. And we don't know why. We don't know how to correct that, perhaps. And we can have our suspicions, and that's, again, what further studies need to do is to try and figure those things out. But I think it's important to say that we can't extrapolate this to everywhere, every other country in the world, etc. So this is unique to that area, and it's somewhat corroborated by the Columbia study, which I assume were New York City residents. So again, both Northeast, urban areas, maybe that's different than the rest of the country, so we can't extrapolate too much. But I do think it is important for people to recognize that the drop in milestones or IQ equivalent points for these infants is very significant, and it should be very, very concerning. And I'm not going to pretend I know what the answer is, because I certainly don't. I don't know what caused it. So if you don't know what causes it for sure, you can't exactly come up with a way to fix it, because you have to identify the problem, exactly what it is first. So what we shouldn't take from this is that masks are always bad, or that the pandemic response is a disaster. But we also can't just discount this and say, well, this is just one situation. We had to do all we have done for the pandemic. It was all entirely necessary. These are the data sets. These are the questions that we need to add into our equation somewhere in a discussion about what we should and should not be doing. And again, I don't know where that is and where your hierarchy of importance or safety, etc. But this needs to be part of the discussion. It needs to be something we pay attention to, and we need to have further study about this. And hopefully there are other people who have similar data sets, or at least have been studying this with different populations, and maybe they have different results. But it'd be useful to know these things. Very often in our discussion with COVID especially, there seems to be a monolithic sort of opinion, and there's a similar but not monolithic reaction to it that is 180 degrees different. It's entirely possible that both sides are partly right and partly wrong. And so I think we need to be mindful of that and hopefully have a real discussion about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and what potential costs and benefits of what we're doing. And if there are ways we can figure out the right way of doing things, we should try and figure that out. But I just want to mention that before the end of the episode, just to be clear that this is not meant to be a hyperbolic and hysterical recording and show. However, again, I see these results and I'm very concerned, and I think people have a reason to be worried about it and to think that we need to figure out what is going on and to try to get to the bottom of it. So with that, I'll leave you. And a reminder that if you want to support the show and keep it free for everyone else, I'd recommend you go to Patreon at patreon.com/theparadox, spelled the same way as the show. And there you can be a monthly supporter of the show and help with the production costs for the show. Thanks again. Thanks again to Dr. Deoni. Before we end, just a quick reminder, if you want to boost efficiency across your practice and make staff scheduling easier, try the Deputy app. You can try the smart technology for free by going to drpodcastnetwork.com/deputy. That's drpodcastnetwork.com/deputy.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.